All right. Whoop. All right. Thank you all so much for coming. A little bit of a smaller room than we were expecting, but I think we can go ahead and get started for the evening. Um, for everybody in the audience who thinks they know things about conversion therapy, raise your hand. All right. Who thinks that you know almost nothing about conversion therapy and you're really just here because your friend dragged you here? Anybody? No? Okay, great. Um, Wonderful. Well, I'm going to take a little bit of time here to introduce our amazing panelists and myself. Hi, my name is Gloria Eastman. I am running for County Board of Supervisors District 5. I am a non-binary person. I also identify as bisexual and polyamorous. That is why I'm here today, because I believe in advocacy and equity. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. Yeah, so I'm going to be moderating tonight. I'm going to go ahead and start over here.
Hello. Okay, there we go. Hi, everyone. My name is Connor Tenner. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a queer trans man, and I am a junior at UWGB, double majoring in public administration and political science.
Hey everyone. Hey everyone, Sean O'Brien, he, him, and I'm the Policy and Advocacy Director at FAIR Wisconsin, which is our state's only statewide LGBTQ civil rights advocacy organization.
Beowulf. There we go. I Hello. I gotta eat this microphone apparently. I go by she or they pronouns, and I'm an assistant professor here in the social work department.
Oh, hello, just in time. Hi, I'm Christine Smith, she, her pronouns. I'm professor of psychology and women's gender and sexuality studies here at UWGB.
Great. Thank you so much, folks. We're going to go over just a couple of rules for the audience tonight. We are all here to listen and learn from each other. We are also here to answer questions. So as you're listening, if you think of anything that you want to ask our wonderful panel, please see James. James, wave your hand. Everybody turn around and look at James. Woo! All right, go see James. James will be circulating a little bit. You can write down your question. He'll get that to me, and I'll be sure to take a look at it and hand it to the panel. We do want this to be continued discussion. We want to make sure that everybody is able to come from here and go out and have these conversations with other people too. So we do have Christine, who has volunteered to hang out afterwards and connect with people. You can definitely feel free to shoot me an email. I've got cards and things. I got to get out of here pretty quick afterwards, but I'd be happy to hear from anybody. And we want to make sure that people are ready to go talk about this with other people. And then the other thing I would say is please hold your applause to the end. We kind of have a fair number of questions. We want to be respectful of everybody's time. So go ahead and do that. We're going to say a lot of things that you're all are going to think are really cool and smart. But hold that applause till the end for us. And then the other thing I want to say is please be respectful of people's pronouns. We all make mistakes. Sometimes we all slip, but if we can all just make a really good effort on that, that'd be great. Without further ado, let's start out with a really basic question. What is conversion therapy? And what other names or other terms have you heard to have it go by? Go ahead. Let's start with you here, Christine.
Well, okay. Nobody in my life has ever said to me, can you speak louder? Because I am a loud person. Is that working? Okay, so conversion therapy in its simplest form is attempts to make people who are not heterosexual. And so it's under the guise of using psychotherapeutic processes, and also includes sort of antiquated ideas about why people are gay, in order to bring them back to heterosexuality. And lots of times it has a more religious component because and so most conversion therapy programs are religiously based because of beliefs about that people should be heterosexual for procreation. It's sort of the simplest. Angela can.
Yeah, Angela, go ahead and follow that up.
Well, I actually thought you were going to say what I heard you say in our meeting earlier, which was that this thing is in and out. Okay. Which was that it's not therapy. So like even just calling it that is not accurate. So like in some of the studies, they don't use that term because it's not. And instead they call it sexual orientation change efforts or sexual orientation and gender identity change efforts. So yeah, just adding that piece in there.
I just want to say sort of psychological practices, because while they do attempt to use psychological practices, they have a pretty distorted view of the pretty antiquated ideas about like using Freudian ideas about why we're heterosexual or not, and also attempts to, and this belief that this is a therapeutic process. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Sean. I know you've got some points on that as well.
I mean, therapy, conversion therapy or reparative therapy, is a practice that has been unanimously condemned by every major medical association in the country. And it really stemmed from the belief that, sexual orientation, LGBTQ, it can be changed. It's something that you need to be cured from. And it is an inherently discredited practice by the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, the National Association of Social Workers. I mean, all of the major medical associations don't find that it actually has any effect. In fact, it actually has negative effects, and can be incredibly harmful for the long-term mental health of our queer and trans youth.
Do you have anything to add?
I think the other three kind of covered it pretty well. So
Sounds good. I would also want to call out that safety is also a name that it sometimes goes under. SAFET. It's sexual attraction fluidity exploration, and it is the term that they use to try to make it sound nice. It is not nice. It still increases shame, which increases those other harmful factors that we'll talk about a little bit later. But that's another name that you might hear it as. It sounds pretty, it's not pretty. And then reparative therapy, I thank you for calling that out. I appreciate that. We do have a question from the audience. Do you have any personal experience with this, and how did it affect you? I know, Christine, you've worked with several people.
Yeah, well, not only have I spoken about this a number of times. For example, the city of Sheboygan brought this to their board several years ago. And so I was one of the people who spoke out against conversion therapy. And so their what do they call it? The city council voted 9-1 to ban conversion therapy for people who are under 18. But I also attended a conversion therapy conference as a spy. So
What a mom.
yeah. And so I did see firsthand not only their ideas about conversion therapy, but also met people who were trying to do that. For example, there was a young man sitting next to me, and he said, his father was a preacher, and his father had his own radio show, et cetera. And he just said to me, I just want my father to love me. That's why I'm doing this. So, I mean, so there are a lot of things that are really, it goes beyond just this idea of therapy, but love and acceptance and, wanting to have a sense of belonging within a community. And so you can see why some people might want to do that, even though it can be incredibly harmful.
So I have not experienced it personally, but I had a student just this year who shared with me and shared with fellow classmates that he had been the recipient of conversion therapy efforts, and he struggled with mental health a lot, and shared that was his reality too, because of that. And I'm going to preface this by saying I love my dad a lot, and he loves me a lot. He loves me a lot too. But when I first came out, this thing's, I mean, when I first came out, he, I think, felt that it was his duty to share a couple books with me on different occasions that were written by people who said that they were able to change their sexuality. I didn't read the whole books or even anything close, just sort of like the back and the front. But basically what these books indicated that quite possibly the women in them were bisexual and had then chosen to be with a man and give up their bisexual identity. And so it's just to know that there's stuff like that out there, that like this sort of story about changing your sexual identity is out there in books to try to get people to believe that this is a thing.
Yeah, I will go ahead and also chime in on this one, even as the moderator. So I went to an Assemblies of God university. The Assemblies of God is an evangelical and Pentecostal denomination of Christianity. They had a requirement that if you were found out to be gay, struggling with gay thoughts, any form of trans, anything that wasn't a cis het mononormative person, it was a requirement to undergo conversion therapy in order to remain enrolled at the school. They would not offer any sort of a refund. You would simply be expelled. And so for me, that also meant that they brought in detransitioners and people that had successfully undergone conversion therapy. And they would put us in multiple hour-long sessions as a group of like over 1,000 of us in a room while this messaging was put out to us in a highly emotional context, along with the additional shame and messaging that we'd all been receiving for years from our churches, our families, everybody else. And so for people like me, like I very specifically had to choose to never use my degree and to never be able to work in the church and give up my entire community when I chose to come out. So that is my personal experience with the low level of this. That's the very lowest level of the sexual orientation change efforts that would fall underneath that category. And that's the very lowest level, and it goes up from there. So that'd be my personal experience with it. Sean, did you want to chime in at all?
Yeah. I've had the pleasure, and I hate saying the term pleasure, but the people who I've met who have experienced conversion therapy and who've survived it are incredible. Their stories are heart-wrenching, but they're beautiful people. One of them is actually the person who cuts my hair. And, in the work that we do at Fair Wisconsin, we go into communities, whether it's a city like Green Bay or a smaller city like Mount Horeb, Madison, Milwaukee, and we hear stories. So I've never been impacted, but we've heard stories every year. I mean, every single like month, we get a story sent to us of somebody in my church is pushing this on me, or this summer camp that my parents sent me to on the outside looks like just a normal summer camp, but when I get there, it is all just attempts at changing my sexual orientation. Also, conversion therapy can be far more subtle than just going to a camp and getting waterboarded. It can be like being told like, oh, you should pray, and having your school make you pray every single day. You might not realize that that's what that's doing. But when you have an institution or a power that is telling you that and making you do things, because of your sexual orientation, that can also be an effort of conversion therapy. So it can be a lot more difficult to spot than we think it is. And also, most people who experience conversion therapy don't report it. Like 99% of folks who experience conversion therapy don't report that it's happening. And it's also not just happening with licensed folks. It's happening in our religious institutions. It's happening with our family, our mothers, our fathers who are telling us, oh, it's just a phase.
Yeah, I would also add to that, a lot of people that are listed as Christian therapists, you should be aware and just listen real close to them. Because that is also one of those things where people can hide behind something that'll be called Christian therapy. And really it also includes sexual orientation change efforts.
So I'm fortunate in that I do not have any firsthand experience with conversion therapy. However, I came out as transgender at 15, and as far as I'm aware, I was one of the first openly trans students at my high school. So they weren't ready for me. So that came with its own set of issues. And I struggled a lot with my mental health throughout high school. And it even got to the point where I was hospitalized on several occasions, and the hospital that I stayed at was religious, and they had a policy that you could not use anything but your legal name if you were trans. And even though other patients could go by nicknames with no problem. And that's not really the treatment that you want to be getting when you're literally being hospitalized because you're suicidal. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I have another question from the audience here. There was an audience member that ahead of time did email in this question. They mentioned being forced to walk for 6 days as part of their conversion therapy. And we were wondering, what other specific techniques have you seen used? And what are those techniques supposedly designed to do? And the way that the writer wrote it was, what is the point? Go ahead, Christine.
So Exodus International, which is actually kind of having a resurgence to some degree, but this was a group, especially around the 80s and 90s, who had a number of chapters across the country. And they were it's their conference that I attended. So they had a very big machine to recruit people. And one of the things that they did, so I mean, walking 6 days is horrendous. They sort of had antiquated ideas about why people were gay, and most of them focused, by the way, on I don't know. Oh no, you can't. Okay, then there you
that
go. Now
microphone.
you can. Excellent. So most of them focused on gay men. Really, they don't really care all that much about about lesbians or bisexual women. And so one of a strong belief was that men were gay because they identified too much with their mothers. So it was sort of a Freudian rejection of their fathers. And what they really needed was male bonding. And so often there would be things like men holding each other and getting that cuddling and loving from other men. Now, yeah, you're right. Exactly.
Oh, how terrible.
Exactly. Here's the thing. The reason Exodus International collapsed was because so many of the men hooked up with each other and married them and got in relationships. That is the reason it collapsed. And so, yeah, not the brightest bulbs. But some of it was indeed based on this idea that of Freudian belief systems that, you came to identify with your mother and wanted to get a father because your father was kind of too weak-willed. So I just had to throw out that story.
All right. Does anybody else have any other techniques or specifics to share?
I mean, like I said earlier, conversion therapy, reparative therapy, it can take many, many, many forms, and some of them can be really, truly horrific. It's not just being told that you need to pray. I have permission to share this story, but we've heard stories at FAIR in our work of people who are being told, who are underage, 12, 13, 14, who are being told that they have to strip down and watch porn. And if they get aroused, then they get beaten. You know, we have people who, you know, have hour-long therapy sessions, and then if they don't give the right answers, they get hit with a belt or a ruler on their hands or on their feet or on their ankles. We've had people who we've heard stories of who have been sent out in a boat for days until they're not allowed to come back until they're cured. And so these things can be awful, but they can also be hour-long sessions every single week where the therapist is telling you that what you're feeling or that your thoughts are wrong or inappropriate. And it can be really damaging, especially when you have that trust with somebody who is a therapist, who is somebody who's designed and whose job it is to help you. And then they're betraying that trust and actually doing more damage than good.
Yeah, Angela, I think you had a little bit of information about the American Psychological Association and their feelings on therapists using this, and you have some feelings on that too.
Well, that and all of the National Association of Social Work, all of them, they basically say that, as you said, Sean, that conversion therapy does more harm than good. And basically, some of the evidence of this was that in looking at youth specifically, or people who were, when they were youth, had a higher likelihood of suicide attempts than those who were not subject to conversion therapy. And that that was even after adjusting for any other known risk factors. So you couldn't say, oh, well, this person already struggled with mental health and it wasn't related to conversion therapy. It was the conversion therapy. And I think a lot of times that there's this idea that LGBTQ people have, more mental health problems because they're LGBTQ. And it's like, no, it's because the environment that you created that made people feel shame for themselves and that they don't belong in this world. And some of the other negative outcomes in another study with adults were just increased distress, depression, hopelessness, suicidal thoughts and behaviors. So it's just all kinds of evidence pointing to the fact that it creates a lot of harm. And so, just going to what you said, Sean, too, that just feeling grateful to have met people who have went through this and that they are still here with us and that they are willing to share that story to kind of help others understand that this is terrible. Yeah.
So a couple of things. First of all, remember that any accredited counseling program will not teach conversion therapy, and they specifically, teach against it, because the consensus is, first of all, there's no reason to convert anyone because being gay is or trans or bi or however people identify sexually is within the range of human development and people's experiences. So there's no need to do that. So look to see, if you're looking for a therapist, look to see where they've gone to school, because people will often, whoa, you came out, I'm going to send you to a therapist. Usually that's a good idea, because your therapist is going to affirm you and then try to talk to your family members, etc. But psychology, early psychology certainly contributed to this. And what they did with trying to convert people back was kind of what you were talking about, was electroshock therapies, that men who identified as gay, they would show them, say, pictures of naked men, and if they became aroused, they would shock them. And it worked sort of to the extent that it did not make them heterosexual, certainly. It killed their sex drive in general, which for some people might be acceptable, but certainly it is not. And so all the sort of attempts, there's been a lot of research on conversion therapy in the past, because now we're like, you shouldn't be converting anyone, but it just isn't successful. And as you said, is absolutely harmful.
Right. I think, yeah, it's important to acknowledge that, early on, that, fields of psychology and social work, did contribute to this problem, sadly. And there's actually a documentary about that because it was listed, in the DSM as considered that it was, I don't know how you would label it, but that it was labeled as like a psychiatric disorder, essentially, to be gay. And that has since changed, which is why I think that there's, so many professional organizations really coming out against this conversion therapy. But the problem is that while so many of us who are licensed professionals, where this is not in our code of ethics, don't do it, it's that 80% of those who were subject to conversion therapy were by religious leaders. And these religious leaders had no psychological training or anything like that, which is why it happened. And so one of the kind of legislative pieces, we've talked about making it, illegal within cities, within states, which we'll talk more about later. But I think that the thing you have to be careful about in the wording is to make sure that that includes not just, by a psychologist or a social worker, but anybody, including religious leaders, that it's something that will not be tolerated.
Yeah. So I do want to get in a little bit here on what is the landscape currently for legislation banning conversion therapy? And specifically, what other places have passed bans? Sean, I'm going to pivot to you on this one.
Yeah. So Fair Wisconsin has introduced over the last 7 sessions a bipartisan bill to ban conversion therapy at the state level. In 2021, we introduced after 5 years of work behind the scenes, going through the administrative rule process with Fair Wisconsin and the National Association of Social Workers, introduced a joint administrative rule to make it a code of conduct violation for any licensed social workers, marriage and family therapists, and professional counselors. Unfortunately, all of these attempts at the state level have been blocked. I hate to get partisan here. All of the Dems in the state legislature have voted for it. We've had a couple of Republicans, but it's been the conservative Republican caucus in our state legislature who has blocked these state bills. But we're going to be introducing another bill again next session. Fair Wisconsin has worked with more than 14 cities, and those cities include Appleton, Cudahy, Eau Claire, Glendale, Kenosha, La Crosse, Madison, Milwaukee, Racine, Sheboygan, Shorewood, Sun Prairie, Superior, and West Allis to implement conversion therapy bans. And we are working with currently 4 other municipalities currently on banning conversion therapy. And we're hopefully going to see that list jump up to 18 or 20 by the end of 2024. I hope I'm not like jumping the gun there, but we're really hopeful that we'll be able to do that. And these bans range from whether or not it's carrying a fine for a practitioner who does this to having their license stripped or being able to be fired for it. These bills do not and are not able to have any sort of impact on religious institutions. And the reason for that is it would be able to be challenged in court, and then the whole ban would be able to be taken off of the record, and we would have to go back to square one, because unfortunately we have not been able to find any way to moderate or restrict conversion therapy in religious institutions because it's a violation of the First Amendment.
Angela or Christine, do you have anything to add to that? I know both of you have worked on some efforts in this area.
The Wisconsin, Wisconsin School Social Workers Association. I am on the legislative committee for that and past president. And so we have every time it's come up, which has been, a few, we have come out against conversion therapy and made sure that we are registered against, testified against it. So I'm sure we'll do so again when it comes up again. But yeah, I guess that going back to what I said earlier about, religious organizations, it is a bit tricky because of church and state that you can't do that. So yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, folks.
I have actually just one more thing on that to jump in. In 2021, Governor Evers signed Executive Order number 122, I believe it was, which prohibits the use of state and federal funds to be used for conversion therapy. So that's just another avenue that we have taken to further restrict this practice.
Great, great. So we have a question from the audience, a live question from the audience even. Who are the wheels behind this? And please be as specific as you can. So who is driving conversion therapy to happen? Who do you see as the people pulling this forward? Why is this still happening? Who are the people behind it?
2 words: fundamentalist Christians.
We currently know that there are 26 reported licensed medical practitioners in the state of Wisconsin in 2023 who are currently practicing conversion therapy. I don't know who they are. I don't know which doctors they are off the top of my head. I could probably find that out while talking with folks at the Trevor Project. The Trevor Project is the largest national youth mental health group in the country, and they compile reports from Wisconsin and across the nation. And I can get the numbers on how many people and how many contacts that happened in Wisconsin. But in 2021, it was between 700 and 2,100 children, people below the age of 18, called and reported some sort of attempt at conversion therapy. I don't have any more specific details and numbers on that for the state of Wisconsin. Yeah. So we know that there's 26 practitioners, although the majority of practitioners and folks who are practicing conversion therapy exist in churches and in religious institutions.
All right. So we've got a few questions here that are a little bit more that are a little bit softer on these things. So what would be your opinion on the view that LGB, lesbian, gay, and bisexual people should simply remain celibate or unmarried, or they should marry somebody that they are not attracted to? Opinions.
So I'm actually working on research right now that is taking a look at Latter-day Saints. It's Mormons is another term, but they call themselves Latter-day Saints or Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm actually co-researching this with an LDS person, and it's about this. There's a podcast of parents who have come out in support of their LGBTQ children. And we're focusing specifically on LGBT children for the purposes of this study. But what's interesting is I am learning a lot about the Mormon faith and about parents realizing that so part of LDS faith is that if you are LGBTQ or LGB, that you remain celibate or you marry. They call it mixed orientation marriages, and that a lot of them are like, it's BS. I mean, it's not, and that even if if there's a story on a website or something for a church, that they're quietly taken down after a while because something happened where that person basically was like, this is a lie. And so the realities are, and I think many people who are LDS actually know this to be true, that like it doesn't work and it's not healthy and it's not helpful. And so and that they don't want that for their kids. When their kids come out to them, they're like, why wouldn't, I have other children, because guess what? A lot of Mormons have other children. They have large families. Is that they see their straight children being able to have families and be happy, and that's what their faith has encouraged them to do their whole life. And they're like, why does my other child not get that same thing? And they don't think it makes any sense. And so, I mean, and by the way, this podcast has 700 episodes. So I'm not talking about like a small thing here.
Do you have a name of that podcast?
It's called Listen, Learn, and Love. And there are parents of trans children as well. But what we're trying to do with the research is find out what is it in these journeys that led them to that path of acceptance. And so anyway, so I think a lot of them know that it's just not, it's not true. Like it's not helpful.
Yeah, I actually was handed a book by my father that included a chapter that said, don't marry your best friend unless you're gay. And the goal was to have you marry somebody of the opposite gender, in quotes on that one. Is long, even if you were just friends, strictly because it was more important to be married and unhappy than it was to be unmarried. And I also, part of the denomination that I was in, and that I was trained to be a pastor in, also had that same stance, that if you are gay, you should just be celibate, and that is the way that your life should be, and that God doesn't ordain any sort of joy or happiness or togetherness for you. And effectively, they were hinting at that you are less of a person and less deserving of love if you are gay. So that is definitely beyond just the LDS, beyond just the Mormons. The Assemblies of God is a pretty major denomination in the world. And so that is certainly a thought that prevails even here in Green Bay. We have 6, 7 Assembly of God churches in Green Bay. So this is right here, and it is right now. All right. All right. What would you say to someone who said it was in their religious responsibility to save people through conversion therapy? Angela, why don't you go ahead and take that one?
Yeah. I think my response is, what about the other parts of your religion? And by that, I mean, so this goes to one of the podcasts that I was listening to, is that they had a person they knew who was on a mission, because they do mission work, and that he had this bracelet, and it said HWLF. And they were like, oh, I've never seen that one. I've seen, WWJD, but what's this one mean? And he said, it means he would love first. And so if you truly believe that like part of your faith is like, saving somebody, I'm sure that the other part of your faith is about loving somebody too. And like, and I know that like we hear that argument all the time of like, but I think just to truly sit down with someone and say like, what are those overarching parts of your religion that you're not paying attention to, and why are you focusing on just this one part?
Yeah, I would say that that was pretty close to what I was told, and it did in fact work on me. So that's great. All right. Does anybody else have anything that they want to chime in on that and how they would speak to somebody who felt it was their religious duty to save somebody through conversion therapy? Do you have anything to add?
Sometimes, and this can be a very hard thing, and this is something that I've had to learn, is sometimes folks who say things like that, they're not in a headspace or in a place where they're willing to have the conversation about ending or stopping conversion therapy. They're not willing to have that. So a lot of the work that we do sometimes revolves around deciding when to have a conversation or when not to have the conversation. And then when we're having that conversation, what are the ways that we're going to do that? And that's going to depend on the person more specifically.
Absolutely. There is another question here. We often hear the terms sexuality is fluid. Can you explain to how that messaging from inside of the queer community is different than conversion therapy being able to influence sexual orientation? Go ahead, Christine.
How much time do we have? So there's
40 minutes.
Okay. All right. Start taking notes. No, to kind of simplify it, sexuality is fluid for some people. It's not for others. Sexuality is incredibly complex. It isn't just one thing or another. It isn't just reinforced and created. And so there's so many things that go into sexuality, and choice. Fluidity doesn't exactly mean choice. It's something just much more complex. It's difficult to explain, but people don't just say, well, I can choose to be gay now because, of all the perks. The parades are fantastic. They are fantastic, right? And that's right. It's a good time in June. And so that's not what fluidity is. That tomorrow I decide that maybe I'll be gay and kind of see how that works out. Fluidity is a more dynamic process. It's based on biology and physiology and a variety of other different psychological factors. And so, it also implies that there's a choice in your sexuality, that you just kind of inherently, made a checklist. I always say that, and I've checked, here's all the perks of being gay, and here's all the perks of being straight. Well, unfortunately, while there are a lot of perks of being gay, let's be clear, being heterosexual gives you, like, hey, not being beaten up and harassed, at least for who you love, it is a big perk there. And so that's not how it works. Your kid didn't decide to become gay just to piss you off or to rebel. And so it gets into our ideas of human nature and how we are as human beings, and that we just simply wake up and make these decisions. I mean, one of the things you could then ask that person is, when did you make the checklist, or when did you choose to do this? And so it creates this really simplistic idea that we're just simple beings, that we just made this decision today, and then tomorrow we're just going to try something out again. So kind of a simple answer. I'm sure panel has many things to add.
Anybody else on that one? How would you talk about the difference between the internal LGBT community messaging of sexuality being fluid, or perhaps that you may experience one thing at one stage in your life and a different thing in another, and sexuality being able to be forced to change?
One of the things that one of the core parts of the legislation when we write it, and the ordinances banning conversion therapy, is allowing for talk therapy for folks to help discover themselves. We make a very clear distinction in legislation between what is considered conversion therapy, reparative therapy, and what is actually like helpful therapy that will help somebody grow versus what will help or what will hurt somebody in the long run.
Yeah, I would say for me, like I would say yes, my sexuality or my understanding of my sexuality has changed over time, but like also my understanding of just who I am as a person in general has changed over time. So, you know, I might identify differently than I did 5 years ago, but I've also like changed and grown as a person and kind of, you know, figured out who I am as a person in the past 5 years. So
That's beautiful.
Oh, can I just add something?
Yes,
to that?
please.
I had an idea when you were talking about like if you're, you know, if you're a parent or a caregiver and a child comes to you about their identity, and you're like, oh, well, you know, how do you know, or is that a phase or whatever? Right, you know, and how do you apply the idea of fluidity? I think the thing I always think about is like, so what if they change their mind? Why not just support them in the moment? You know, like why not? What would hurt to do that?
The goth phase, why not? Yeah, that's also part of our trying on different kinds of identities.
And I do want to also just call back attention to that safety word that I talked about earlier. That's why that is such a dangerous label for this kind of therapy. Is because it uses that word fluidity that we hear inside of the LGBT community, and it applies it to something that is specifically anti-LGBTQ. It is very important that we clock in that they know, they see us, they know they are not ignorant, and they are being very specific about the tactics that they are using when they are creating this messaging. So 2 questions here. I think we kind of already answered this one, but does conversion therapy work? That's what I thought. And then why are we doing something that is not backed up by research? And we being the grand we.
Okay, so when I was at undercover at Exodus International's conference, it was very interesting because one of the panelists or presenters did a very good job of kind of explaining what we know about sexuality and why people are gay and straight and bi and what the research was at the particular time, which wasn't very good and still isn't, and has gone by the wayside because it's gotten to the point that who cares? And so they talked about a little bit of the research we knew, Simon LeVay's research on brains, et cetera. But after kind of going through and doing a very good job, I was quite impressed. The end comment was, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter why they're gay. It's wrong. And so the research is irrelevant. But because there's research, and some folks are not only scientifically savvy, but are suspicious of research. Have we not learned this around COVID? And so, so research is immaterial, and especially when it doesn't back up people's worldview. So, and when it comes down to if there's the 2 options for many people, I mean, you're talking about challenging how they see the world. And so that's why the research is going to be irrelevant for them.
Do we have any data on the failure rates of conversion therapy? People that have gone through the program and have come back out as gay in the future? And also, what do you think would affect those kinds of results? What are the impacting factors that people are facing when they try to live as a straight person that might cause them to try that?
Well, you know, there is a little bit of research, and God, I want to say in the mid-90s, there was a study that actually came out that was published in a respectable journal, the Archives of Sexual Behavior, that found that some men in their study had actually reduced their attraction to other men. And needless to say, it was absolutely attacked. And actually, the author has since rescinded it and rescinded his ideas, and the article's been retracted. And so for some folks, that, as the young man sitting next to me at this conference said, I mean, there's a strong motivation to want this to work, to, you know, have your family love you and embrace you. And so for some people, they may see this at least being successful for a period of time. At that conference was John Paul, who's one of the poster children, poster great people, I don't know, for and he'd been in a lot of advertisements, et cetera, for the ex-gay movement. And he was actually at the conference. About 5 years after that, he was found in a gay bar in Washington, D.C. And then now he's living with his husband. But there are strong motivators for folks. And so the little research that's out there, like that particular study by Spitzer, showed a bit, because there is a desirability there. And so, and people want this, people who go into this, and these were adults, often wanted it to work because they had received so much pressure and societal messaging about how bad is the LGBTQ.
I have not seen a single study, a single credible study out there. And I think there's a big difference to make in the difference between what is a credible study and what is not a credible study. We have folks in the state capitol who come in all of the time waving around studies, and it might just be like one person who put their thought on a piece of paper. It's not a credible study. I have seen 0 credible studies that show that conversion therapy works or has ever worked. You know, we do see folks who say, oh, you know, I thought I was straight for a little while, but I actually realized that I just wanted the torture and the pain to stop. People don't, it's not actually having an effect. It's not actually changing anybody's sexual orientation or attraction rates. All it's doing is making them go back into the closet and hide who they truly are. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to make people stop hurting them and stop attacking them. And they're trying to, again, feel safe from these attacks on them. And so that's the only time that we ever see it, is when people are going back into the closet. It's not actually changing anything.
Well, and so what best practice is, and you alluded to this earlier, but best practice is encouraging and supporting self-acceptance. And that's written across many places. So that's kind of what is the talk therapy element that you talk about, is encouraging self-acceptance.
Yeah. We talked about this a little bit before, but I do want to give everybody a chance to expand specifically on this question. What are the consequences on people who have been through conversion therapy? And if you want to get specific, this would be a great time to tell some stories of people that you know. I will go ahead and get us started while folks ponder a little bit. So being that I went to the university that I sure did go to, I have several friends who have been through conversion therapy. I have one that was a student body president while he was going through conversion therapy. And it was a pretty extreme form. Certainly he was one that was beaten repeatedly. When he talks about, now he's written articles on it in newspapers and things in Minnesota. And when he talks about it now, he talks about how it was so hard for him to focus on what he was studying. It was so hard for him to be able to get up in the morning and do all the things that he needed to do. And it continued to follow him because it didn't work and it never got better, despite all the promises that it would get better for him if he just kept going with the conversion therapy. And that did become an extreme danger to his health and to his well-being. So that's certainly something to keep in mind. And I would also say that, you know, I have another friend who does live in a mixed orientation marriage. And after that relationship started, I certainly saw a lot of light leave from those eyes. And a large portion of that was that he was also going to have to give up his degree and never be able to use it unless he married a woman. And so, you know, he did that. They have a couple of kids. And that is a person who still was not allowed to use that degree anyway, because they considered him a risk. So they promised him that if he did this, that he would have the things that he wanted, and then they held it from him anyway. So I'll say that. Go ahead for yeah, Sean, are you ready?
Studies show that folks who survive conversion therapy are 2.5 times more likely to attempt suicide. And this comes on top of when our queer and trans youth are already 47% more likely to attempt suicide. Or sorry, 47% of queer and trans youth have attempted suicide within the past year. And so, you know, when we start adding conversion therapy on that, 2.5 times more likely to attempt suicide. Conversion therapy is also incredibly expensive in like the outcomes. $8.58 billion in economic costs based on the need for mental health care after receiving conversion therapy, physical care, rehousing. I mean, just the financial cost that comes from conversion therapy is staggering. So, I mean, that's just one of it. I mean, we can put numbers to anything, but we also have to talk about what does conversion therapy do to families. I mean, it rips them apart. It destroys trust from children to their parents. It hurts the trust in licensed medical care professionals who these folks thought were there to help them. Queer folks already struggle with getting access to mental health care. And then when we're adding in, is this person, am I going to go see this person and they're going to try to practice conversion therapy on me, or are they actually going to try to help me? It starts building some deep distrust in the medical care system. So the impacts kind of range from just not only what's happening with the individual in it, but also to families and also like our economy too.
This is a question from the audience. Are the people practicing conversion therapy aware of its harmful effects? That grin over there, Christine.
I think many think the ends justify the means, right? That often the choice is eternal damnation or salvation. And so that's a tough one to compete with. And so I think for a lot of people, they think they are indeed saving your soul, even if it's this process, that horrendous process.
Right. And I think, right, that they do know and they don't, well, I don't know. A comparison I think of is people being so anti-gay that during the AIDS epidemic, that the belief is that, you know, AIDS was the cure for gay people because it eliminated them. And so, you know, just that level of like not caring.
Yeah. Another question from the audience. We touched on it a little bit earlier. What are better forms of therapy to help people who are gay or trans?
Well, gender affirming therapy, certainly for trans youth and trans adults as well. And, you know, affirming therapy in general. And so one of the, I think the issues with a lot of folks who are going through conversion therapy and even the aftermath is it disconnects them from a queer community that can be affirming and supportive of them. And so that's sort of another one, because I think for folks who are struggling and are able to connect to a community, a queer community, as opposed to another community says you need to change and or we won't love you, as opposed to another community that embraces them. And so those are, having access and knowing that community exists and being able to access it in some ways is, I think, absolutely essential for all of us.
Anybody else want to add anything about positive therapies for gay and trans people? How can we achieve a conversion therapy ban in the future? Sean, I think you had some thoughts and some feelings about this one.
Call your local elected officials. If you're a local elected official, consider introducing a ban on conversion therapy. Fair Wisconsin is absolutely ready and willing to help any elected officials write legislation. We have model legislation. We have the language of best practice. But the number one thing that we can do to start working on this is one, in educational forums like this. Not enough folks know that conversion therapy is still happening. And in fact, in 2024, I don't think we should still be having this conversation. Conversion therapy should have been banned a long, long, long time ago. But get involved in government. If you live in a smaller community, encourage your local elected officials to write a ban. Fair Wisconsin hosts an annual lobby day or a biannual lobby day. Come to that. We'll help you. We'll prepare you with all the talking points and materials to come down to the Capitol and actually talk to your elected officials, to the governor, to the attorney general, whoever you need to talk to about that. Also, call your elected officials. They work for you. So go give them a call. They want to hear from you on this. They want to hear from the people in their communities. And Fair Wisconsin, we're the not national. Oh my goodness, we're the state group. But they already know what we're gonna say. They already know that Fair Wisconsin is against conversion therapy. But when elected officials start hearing from their constituents, that can be quite impactful. So I don't know. Also, please go vote. Voting is really, 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 really important. Yeah.
I'll also add to that. You can run. You can run. All of you can run. We can run. It is not a problem that you are gay. You can be gay and you can run.
Just keep in mind that the same people who are supporting conversion therapy are also the ones who are making trans kids' lives miserable by denying them gender affirming care and are trying to ban books. So, so they're not just doing one thing. They're doing a number of things to attack the LGBTQ community.
All right. So now this is one I know, Sean, you talked a little bit about that it's hard to write legislation that stops the churches and the religious organizations. But this is a question from the audience, is how can we stop or advocate for conversion therapy to stop as a whole across the board?
So I'm going to give an example that's happening right now. Currently in Mount Horeb, Wisconsin, they're working on a ban on conversion therapy. And in that, in Mount Horeb, we know that there are currently 3 churches that are actively practicing conversion therapy. And while we can't write a piece of legislation or a bill or anything that targets those churches or those religious institutions, what we're doing is we're encouraging folks to not attend those religious institutions. We're telling them, hey, if this religious institution is practicing this, maybe don't send your kids there. Maybe don't go there because it's probably not a safe place and they're probably not teaching the things that the Bible actually teaches, depending on your interpretation of course, the Bible and how you read it.
If you have questions on that, email me.
So we encourage communities. I mean, as much as Fair Wisconsin can hold elected officials and communities responsible for harmful acts, it's also community members have to take responsibility in their own communities. So if you know of a religious institution or a group that is practicing conversion therapy, start spreading the word. Start letting people know. You might stop a kid from ending up walking into that space and being in danger. So that's one of the best things to do, is just start holding your community members accountable.
Well, and I think that the podcast I'm listening to exemplifies that, because it's a lot of people who go to this church, and once they start having conversations with each other, realize that there's a lot, like, these parents feel alone, and then they understand that there were more people than they thought who were supportive of LGBTQ people. And so, you know, people who don't follow that doctrine getting together and supporting each other, and so many support groups have actually, I mean, support groups, but so many like groups have come out to help support LGBTQ youth who are LDS. And like, it's a complicated relationship, right? Like I have so many questions sometimes when I'm listening about people who choose to stay in the church while also supporting their, you know, their child. And you know, so there's complications there. But I think if you're able to, you know, have conversations with even family members who are part of a religion where, you know, it's, you know, a sin to be gay or whatever, to just open up. Like, even doctor might say one thing, but you can at least encourage your family members to have conversation, you know, to have conversations with them and friends.
I also do want to be clear that not all religious institutions practice conversion therapy. Fair Wisconsin works with, we have a large component of our work called Voices of Faith. And, you know, we have a lot of queer clergy in the state of Wisconsin, a lot of open and affirming churches who are working to, they acknowledge, and also we acknowledge the harms that religious institutions have caused, but not all religious institutions are practicing conversion therapy. And, you know, some of the biggest advocates for conversion therapy have actually been, or advocates for banning conversion therapy, I should say, have been religious leaders. And I mean, the Wisconsin 1982 law that banned discrimination based on sexual orientation was led and could not have been passed without support from religious institutions.
I do want to circle back to something that you said and just underline it a little bit about knowing where you're sending your kids or where your parents are sending the kids. My dad had no idea what kind of doctrine we were being pushed on. Specifically, the only thing that he regretted was the significant level of purity culture that I was put in. But he had no idea the level of messaging that we were receiving or the kind of messaging that we were receiving. And so it is amazing how even very tuned in religious parents don't know what's happening in kids' church. They don't know what's happening in youth group. They don't know what's happening on youth camp or any of the other things. So definitely make sure that the people you know that have kids know where their kids are going and know what they're teaching. I just wanted to underline that since that was my personal experience. Yeah. All right, we are getting real close to the end here, which is great because we are getting real close to the end here. As licensing is through the state, how are municipal bans enforced with effect? So how do these work, Sean?
Oh boy, it's a complicated question because as much as you can have a ban, it also is up to the city and the attorneys in the city and the police in the city, the prosecutors who work for the city. Also, people need to report that conversion therapy is happening. And so the enforcement of this, municipal bans can kind of come in a variety of ways. As one of them can be, whether or not you're going to fine somebody. Whether or not you're we've seen fines range anywhere from, a slap on the wrist fine of, $1,000 to some really substantial fines of, $5,000, $10,000, $20,000. We've also seen, punishments for folks who practice conversion therapy being reported to the licensing board and then having disciplinary action taken through that, which would be, if our administrative rule hadn't been overturned, that would have been, probably revocation of your license, being stripped of it, being fired, not being able to practice in Wisconsin in the future. But right now in the state of Wisconsin, it's mostly at local levels, fines, like I said, that range from about $1,000, and they can range upwards, but it depends on a lot of like municipal ordinances and codes and stuff like that.
All right. We're going to end on a little bit of a high note here. So what are ways that we can support survivors of conversion therapy? And specifically for allies, people that are not gay, but what are people that are allies? What can they do? So how would you support survivors, and how can allies be a part of this conversation?
Well, for my student, I gave him extensions on deadlines because of his mental health. And like, I want him to be successful and do well. And like, if that's what it takes, like, that's easy peasy. Like, so I think, support can look like a lot of different things, but in my role, that's what support looked like that day.
Creating affirming communities, and that includes allies, certainly. And so, I think when people recognize that we celebrate their authenticity and them living their lives, authentically under their own terms, that really can be very freeing, especially if you've been through an experience where people have told you the exact opposite.
Do you have any ideas on? Yeah, absolutely. What are ways that we can support survivors of conversion therapy? And what would you want from allies?
I guess an answer to both questions is just listen. Especially when, as an ally, when you're learning more about a community that you're not a part of, definitely listen more than you're speaking.
Make space for them to listen or talk. If you know somebody who's going through it, connect them with mental health providers who are safe. And then also join the effort to ban conversion therapy. That's a really big one. But also, I think celebrating joy, celebrating queer joy, celebrating trans joy, go to Pride, be more out, be more proud. I think that's all very important when we're talking about supporting communities.
One last thing about supporting survivors is being aware of the internalized homophobia and transphobia that might be there. And I think which is what leads sometimes adults to seek conversion therapy. Because I think we know with kids, it's like not their choice. But with adults, it can be internalized homophobia or transphobia.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for hanging with us here. You know what, Randy? I trust you. Go ahead.
Yeah, there is definitely leeway within religious institutions. I mean, because spare the rod and spoil the child, but it certainly is what some people do indeed see this as a form of child abuse. Absolutely. I don't know, Sean.
Yes, and there's that was a tact that a lot of groups were using at one point. And right now, we found that those bills proving it can be hard, and enforcing that can be really hard. And so that's why we've switched more towards the tack of disciplinary action through licensed medical professionals. That's kind of that reason. It's definitely, one of the options, but we found that it has not been as successful with banning conversion therapy as that way, because it's harder to prove. And it also, some of that dependent on the state here and without reading specific legislation, it can also be hard because sometimes the children need to be then the one to report it, dependent on the state. And that's not always the way that it happens. Sometimes it's more often than not, it's parents who are the ones who are reporting it and then taking it to court from there on.
All right, Ed.
So we've at most had again, without looking at the legislation, so I don't have the legislation in front of me. I think we had at one point 4 Republicans in the state legislature who had signed on. The new maps for the state legislature really do open up a path, since it has been bipartisan, to ban conversion therapy. We've never actually been able to get a hearing on it. And we're hoping that we got very close this session. We had a couple of hearings on the JCRAR Joint Committee for Review of Administrative Rules bill. We had a hearing on that one, and we think that we can get a hearing next session. It just kind of depends on what the makeup of the legislature looks like. But we do know that there is bipartisan support for that in our state. So again, I hope that we can get it done soon, but it really depends on, what our legislature looks like.
Yeah. And you were alluding to this already, but just to clarify, it's not that the whole Senate and Assembly needs to vote on it. It's specifically this joint committee for review of administrative rules. So it's a committee that is then voting on rules for it's the Department of Safety and Public Standards.
Yeah. So technically, actually, we had a ban on conversion therapy for about a week. We had a ban on conversion therapy for about a week. It went into effect in mid-December. We've been working on it for 5 years. On January 6th, the Joint Committee for the Review of Administrative Rules, or JCRAR, led by Senator Steve Nass, voted to suspend the rule. And so they actually took a protection that was in place and did what's called an indefinite suspension. Currently, that rule, it's through 2024. Although they're going to immediately, as soon as it goes back into effect, they're going to immediately resuspend it. And currently, the governor has actually filed an original action request with the Supreme Court in order to say that the JCRAR can't indefinitely suspend rules, and that legislative rulemaking has to go through the whole body rather than just a committee. But that's just one of the forms of legislation. That's an administrative rule. We also have a statewide ban that would put it into state statute, and that's the one that we've not ever gotten a hearing on, but we're hoping to.
Sylvia.
I mean, I think so. One, it's already going to have an effect because of the new maps that we're seeing in the state legislature. The fact that our Supreme Court, is now controlled by a liberal majority. I think that the governor filing the original petition request for the social workers rule MPSW 20 and allowing them to write their own code of conduct, I think that will be heard by the Supreme Court, and I am, knock on wood, fairly confident that they'll rule in favor of that. But in terms of just like another Supreme Court litigation that would go that way, I don't believe, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but I don't believe that we have a case that could make it all the way to the state Supreme Court and then have them ban it via court action. Another thing to say about that is, the queer community has lived by the whim of the court for a very, very, very long time. And we can't keep counting on the courts and the shifts in, the ideology of the court. So that's why we're going for a statewide ban through legislation, is because we're a little tired of living by what the court eats for breakfast.
Yeah, I think we all saw that with the fall of Roe, that our civil rights, when they are not enshrined in law, are tenuous at best. So I think that that's a great point. On that, I am going to call it for the evening. If you want to stick around and talk, like I said, Christine's available. If you want to grab my email, feel free to do that. Yeah, so thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.